there are examples that are showing that the use of cultural, spiritual, indigenous, communal frameworks to address violence, specifically through the lens of local control and local funding, are having results that may indicate for the specific issues related to violence in the Black community that this is a necessary uh, practice. So the example we use is Newark, New Jersey. Newark, the mayor is Ross Baraka. He's the son of Amiri Baraka. Amiri Baraka was the MC, the parliamentarian for the Gary Black Power Conference. He led a grassroots community organizing campaign that got a Black mayor elected, Black city council people elected. Um, so really built a Newark, was part of a Newark community response to the riot of 67 in Newark that centered community control, culture, institution building, and they brought that approach to their community violence intervention ecosystem. So as opposed to bringing in only Gary Slutkin or only the people from New Chicago, they brought in one of the people who helped negotiate the Bloods and Crips gang truce in LA. And they brought him in, working with the community, working with Rutgers to lead a community violence intervention. This term is being thrown around too much too, but ecosystem. But it's not just like we built a bunch of nonprofits and called it the ecosystem. The ecosystem has different institutions that play different components. So in Newark, you may have, Minister Abdul Haq, and you have his crew, which is more of the, outside Nation of Islam, cultural, spiritual influence organizations, but they're at the table with Rutgers. They're at the table with the funders. They're at the table with the mainstream nonprofits. And not only are they at the table with them, they're actually given support by the mayor of Newark to say, these guys run the show. The people on the ground run the show, and the funders and the nonprofits are responsive to them. The public health people, the mainstream public health nonprofits, are a different part of the ecosystem. They may have slightly different beliefs than the people I just talked about, but they play their own role, but they also have elements of community control built into their system. So the Newark Community Street Team is very similar to Safe Streets, but they also take political stances that Safe Streets in Baltimore have not, and from my understanding, cannot take. They're very adamant that the funding from legalized cannabis in New Jersey should not go to the police, but it should go to be reinvested in the community. I don't think Safe Streets ever said anything like that. In fact, LifeBridge House, one of the organizations that oversees half of the Safe Street sites in Baltimore on behalf of Catholic Charities, came out in support of sentencing enhancements for people carrying illegal guns during last year's legislative assembly. So that's an example of a fundamentally different approach to violence intervention in terms of who the ecosystem is accountable to. Because if it's accountable to the Black grassroots and community, they're going to be pushing more upstream interventions like community investment. If it's accountable to the white nonprofit industrial complex, it's going to be more oriented towards cooperation with police, foundation funding, and that leads them to support things like increased criminalization, even when national best practice on CVI says don't do that. And these distinctions become, because one thing that people have said is like, oh yeah, we're doing what Newark is doing, because we have nonprofits that do services just like they do. But the arrangement of power and the arrangement of accountability and even the funding ecosystem is so fundamentally different here that it cannot produce the same results. So last thing I'll say on that is, like, Newark created a local funding pool for its violence intervention services. In 2020, I believe, they took money from the police budget and actually reoriented to create this Office of Public Safety. This Office of Public Safety works with grassroots organizations, but it doesn't lead them directly. It's a coordinating entity. And when they did the report card for community violence intervention best practices, Newark actually came out 20th of 50 cities, despite cutting their murder rate literally in half, because the report card says the best practice is to have the power centralized in the executive agency and to aggregate foundation money and federal money and disseminate that locally with technical assistance. Newark is doing the opposite. They're taking local money, giving the methodologies from the ground and basically having the ground provide a form of technical assistance to the city and to the foundations. And for that, they are being downgraded by the think tank national establishment who talks about community violence dimension. It is a perfect example of everything that's wrong with the nonprofit industrial complex. And it's a deep example about the anxiety around Black community sovereignty and Black community control of these resources. Because if Newark is the best practice, we may not need to. It doesn't mean that Slutkin and Chicago don't have a role to play, but they're not the center anymore. The resources don't flow through them. They don't get to control the criteria on every federal grant, on every federal funding application. And this is a multi-billion-dollar industry that's growing up on the backs of the people who have died in our streets. So we owe it to them to have this level of precision and rigor and to call out people who are hustling off the suffering of our dead.